Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. South Korea's spy agency confirmed North Korea's direct involvement in the war in Ukraine, saying that Russian Navy transport ships moved North Korean troops. North Korea has codified South Korea as a hostile state in its constitution. Today we discuss how North Korea has stoked tensions on the Korean Peninsula and beyond.
He's getting help from North Korea with shells, equipment, now even people.
So that kind of feedback from a real battlefield to North Korea to be able to make adjustments on their weapons.
In the studio with me, Ms. Beth Long, a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. Ms. Long served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and Chairman of NATO's high-level group on nuclear issues. Ms. Long was an operations officer for the Central Intelligence Agency. Also joining us, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency and served as a CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good to be back.
Now, Mr. Klingner, South Korea's National Intelligence Service said North Korea has shipped 1,500 soldiers on Russia's Far East for training. And Korean media reports citing intelligence sources that North Korea has decided to send 12,000 troops to Russia. What does North Korea stand to gain strategically, and wouldn't there be any backfires on them?
Well, it's certainly a fast developing story. Just recently, the South Korean Vice Minister of Defense said that perhaps it was only civilian workers in the Far East, as North Korea has sent for decades, or it could be military technicians or assistants to monitor the use of North Korean artillery shells and missiles. Now it seems the NIS has gathered new information which confirmed that it'll be special forces or combat troops. So certainly an escalation of North Korean involvement in the Ukraine war, and it's leading South Korea to question whether it will more directly provide lethal aid to help Ukraine fight off not only Russia but now Ukrainian or North Korean involvement.
And Mr. Klingner, is North Korea now effectively allied to Russia, going beyond just a marriage of convenience over the Ukraine war?
I'd say yes and no. Certainly their interests are aligned. They signed the strategic partnership, but people sort of debate whether it's a true alliance, whether it's not really a mutual defense treaty. It's certainly not to the level of America's alliances with South Korea and Japan. It does still seem to be sort of a marriage of convenience in the sense of if before North Korea was providing massive amounts of artillery shells and dozens of newer missiles, and now it's providing troops, but most likely in return for benefits, economic, food aid, and what's worrisome is whether it increases the likelihood that Russia will provide more sensitive military technology to North Korea, which would increase the threat to South Korea, Japan, as well as U.S. forces stationed in the region.
Mm-hmm. And Ms. Long, how effective will these North Korean soldiers be in the war when they don't speak Russians? And isn't it more complicated to integrate troops into another country's army than to just use mercenaries to fill the gap?
Yes, and in fact, I don't think there'll be much anticipation of actually taking North Korean ground troops and integrating them into Russian units. And normally, at most, what will happen is there'll be a battalion of North Koreans by themselves, perhaps commanded jointly by Russians and or North Koreans. But having them mix and match ends up being a disaster and will probably lead to even more desertions. But what we normally see when North Korea does this is they'll have specific roles and specific responsibilities or specific territorial deployments, and there'll not be much of a mix. Quite frankly, it would be almost as dangerous for Russian soldiers in those circumstances as it would be for the Ukrainians.
And would Russia want to send them to dangerous places? They're having difficult times recruiting soldiers.
Yes, there's a perception, frankly, of North Korean soldiers traditionally being used as cannon fodder, basically sent to areas where the conflict is violent, where there's the most injuries and the most deaths, and you don't want to use Russian soldiers to do that, so you sacrifice North Korean soldiers, which will probably increase the desertions that we're already beginning to see.
Right. And Mr. Klingner, General Charles Flynn, the U.S. Army's Indo-Pacific commander, told me and other reporters in Washington this week that North Korea is getting real-time feedback on its weapons from battlefield for the first time. How much of a threat is this to Korea's security?
Well, on the real-time gaining of knowledge, if we look at what North Korea is providing, so massive amounts of artillery shells, which could be decades old, and there apparently has a fairly high failure rate. What is also more striking is that even the newly produced missiles, perhaps even produced in the last year or so, are also having a fairly high failure rate. So it'd be more concerning that North Korea learns from the mistakes of these newer missiles, but it also reflects perhaps poor production quality assurance, et cetera. So, but I think more worrisome still is whether by increasing its contribution to the Russian war effort, that may have raised the price that Russia is willing to pay for North Korean involvement. That if perhaps there was a hesitancy to provide certain types of more sensitive military technology, now that North Korea is providing troops, and we don't know what the top end of that contribution could be.
And Ms. Long, should South Korea consider sending lethal weapons to Ukraine? South Korea's prime minister warned a few months ago, if Russia crosses the line, the red line, then South Korea will also seriously consider sending weapons to Ukraine. And if, as we talk about, Russia is out to transfer high-tech military technology to North Korea, then should South Korea send lethal weapons to Ukraine?
Well, I think South Korea always has to leave that on the table. Because it is unclear what exactly North Korea is getting in exchange from Russia. And taking that off the table prematurely, I think, is unwise. Or the leadership in South Korea has been tremendous in leaving it ambiguous. I think it really depends. Look, what North Korea is getting right now is they're getting money, they're solidifying their relationship with Russia, they're getting experienced personnel, they're getting the ability to test their weaponry and see how it acts in the marketplace. They're getting access probably to Russian Wagner and other commercial enterprises where they can make more money. As the gentleman pointed out, we don't really know the level of military support. I think probably South Korea will bide its time and let this situation gel a bit further and allow itself to have a better idea of exactly what appears to be the impact in North Korea of the exchange with Russia, and then gauge accordingly. But I would not be surprised if South Korean leadership started to open the aperture regarding military or military type support for Ukraine.
Mr. Klingner, what South Korea can offer to Ukraine with its weapons, doesn't that go far beyond what North Korea can offer to Russia?
Well, South Korea has already indirectly been providing lethal aid. Artillery shells, large amounts, perhaps 500,000 shells, have been sold to Poland or to the United States, which then replenish stocks that were more directly provided to Ukrainian forces. So South Korea could decide to sort of directly, blatantly, publicly provide military assistance to Ukraine, or they may continue to have indirect aid in order not to aggravate a Russian, perhaps, response against South Korea, a diplomatic or economic response. So in the past, Seoul had said if Russia conducted a particularly egregious action, which was against international community consensus of what was acceptable, that could trigger South Korea's provision of direct lethal aid. Well, since then, we've seen Russia directly attack children's hospitals, civilian hospitals, et cetera. So it's gone beyond what South Korea had hinted would trigger it. So it could be now that we have direct North Korean troop involvement that may induce South Korea to directly provide lethal aid, or it may decide to increase its indirect flow.
And the Europeans are talking about sanctioning North Korea if indeed it proves to be true that North Korea sent soldiers there. What can United States and South Korea do, Ms. Long?
I think both South Korea and the U.S. can provide their own sanctions, whether they're international sanctions or, of course, bilateral sanctions. The U.S. can definitely work behind the scenes regarding North Korean access to financial and other instruments. Everybody knows that the North Koreans have always had a certain amount of smuggling. That's been curtailed. They can clamp down on that and engage the international community. I think that as far as South Korea is concerned, there's so much going on the border with the recent bombing of the roads into South Korea, with the back and forth over the alleged drone usage, that South Korea will probably take a cautious approach to escalating and penalizing North Korea directly. But certainly I think the route to changing or augmenting or even modifying what it's doing indirectly in Europe and Ukraine in particular will be one of the very first acts.
And Mr. Klingner, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Rudenko said that South Korea's actions are escalating tensions on the Korean Peninsula and that Russia will provide military assistance to North Korea if it comes under attack. Now, with North Korean soldiers assisting with Russia's war efforts, do you think it's more likely that Russia would like to exert influence over the Korean Peninsula? Do you think it is possible that Russia could do joint exercises with North Korea and do show of force around the peninsula?
Well, I think it's certainly North Korea that's raising tensions on the peninsula, as it always has. As for how far Russia would go, the strategic agreement between Moscow and Pyongyang, talks about supporting each other if they're attacked. But I don't think we're likely to see Russian forces involved on the peninsula. Even during the Korean War, they weren't involved other than sending some pilots. So I don't think it would be a large-scale, support to North Korea. But of course, it would only be in response to major hostilities on the peninsula. Whether we see joint exercises as Russia and China have done, I think that's a further leap. And even with the Russian and Chinese military exercises, they're not truly combined operations. They're more like parallel operations in adjacent locations. So it's even with the Chinese forces, we don't see an integration of command structure. We don't really see an integration of military operations. In some ways, it's more a show. And I think if Russia did that with North Korea, which I still think is unlikely, it would be more, forces in the same area, not necessarily conducting truly integrated combined operations.
On your take on the low possibility that Russian soldiers will be on the Korean Peninsula, experts in South Korea are concerned that it could be different this time because North Korea and Russia signed that comprehensive strategic partnership treaty just a few months ago, back in June. And because intelligence sources say that North Korea has decided to send 12,000 troops to Russia, this time Russia could send soldiers to Korea in a contingency situation.
Well, the agreement or the strategic partnership talks about providing support during major hostilities. So unless North Korea attacks, then it's a moot point. Certainly the U.S. and South Korea are not planning to attack unless in response to a North Korean major hostility or very clear indications from intelligence sources that North Korea is about to launch a preemptive attack. So in a way, it's a moot point that we can debate. But as I pointed out, is even during the Korean War, which obviously was very expansive and extensive, Russia only provided some pilots to that conflict.
Just to add a point, let's not forget too that in Russia right now, they're experiencing such a difficult manpower issue that actually some of the North Koreans are assuming roles in Russian manufacturing and Russian supply. So for Russia to take its very scarce resources of military and send them over to augment North Korea, unless it's in the most dire situations, they simply don't even have enough now to defend themselves from Ukraine. So I think it's highly unlikely.
And Mr. Klingner, North Korea revised constitution defining South Korea as an outright hostile state. It also blew up sections of railroads and roads that connects into South Korea and accused South Korea of infiltrating drones to Pyongyang. The U.S., South Korea, and Japan said that North Korea was taking deliberate actions to raise tensions. Is North Korea setting the stage for a more hostile stance against South Korea?
Well, I think it's always been a very hostile stance, and the question always is, if the Korean Peninsula always seems to be on the knife edge of a crisis, how far will North Korea go? At the beginning of the year, some analysts thought that North Korea had already made the strategic decision to go to war. Most of us, or all of us, disagreed with that, but many of us did think that it was going to be a very tense year, a very bumpy ride. But until recently, it's actually been fairly quiet. During the summer, perhaps North Korea was more focused on responding to the massive floods. In recent months, we've seen a resumption of missile launches. We've seen North Korea unveil the highly enriched uranium facility, which was previously covert, if not well known to intelligence sources. And now we see the sending of troops to Russia. So we have really an escalation of if not provocations, of potential provocations in Europe with North Korean troops there, and also on the peninsula with his very provocative actions and very inflammatory language. So the concern many of us often have is that we may stumble into a conflict either through a misinterpretation by North Korea of Allied intentions, or if there's some localized incident along the DMZ or the Northern Limit Line, that could escalate as each side responds to the other's actions.
I don't see them using this as an excuse to go into a full-on escalation that we haven't seen before.
Why don't you see that?
I don't see the circumstances currently with North Korea focused, at least for the moment, with sending its supplies, its troops, and its special forces to Ukraine. There's the focus of their effort. I don't think there's been a big change on the ground. If anything, I think North Korea is trying to distract a bit from what's happening in Europe by these local kerfluffles in order to basically keep the news away from what is doing in Ukraine.
And Ms. Long, South Korea neither confirms nor denies sending drones into Pyongyang. Former senior U.S. military officers say that even if a U.S. stealth jet hit Kim Jong-un's office, North Korea would not know about that. Do you think there is a real possibility that South Korea could have sent the drones to Pyongyang? Do you think it's a good idea to keep North Korea on its toes, or would you rather not have unnecessary escalation?
It's always a good idea to keep North Korea on its toes because it makes a point of keeping South Korea on its toes. But do I think that this was a military act or decision by South Korea to send drones over Pyongyang? If it was an incredibly successful effort, and in fact, I find it very rich that Kim Yo-jong complained to the South Koreans that drones flew by night over their capital city and dropped leaflets, something, by the way, that traditionally is done by balloons with civilian efforts. She complained to the South Koreans that somehow this was an affront, rather than being concerned about the fact that her military defenses, by the way, apparently allowed rather civilian-style drones all the way into the capital where they were able to drop things. If this had been a Ukrainian militia, those drones could have very well had grenades attached to them. So I find it very rich, the rather amateurish position that the North Koreans are taking on this whole matter.
And Ms. Long, former President Trump, in a recent speech in Economic Club, said that South Korea is a money machine, and that if he were there, South Korea would pay $10 billion a year. Now, South Korea and the United States recently reached a special measures agreement and has decided on the next 5-year cost sharing. And under that, in 2026, Korea's contribution will increase by 8.3%. For now, South Korea is known to pay about $1 billion annually. So what President Trump is saying, that number is about 9 times more. Is that a reasonable price given the current geopolitics in the region?
I don't really know whether it's a reasonable price given the geopolitics, but I can say there's two things I think that are very important in that particular scenario. Number one is context. For President Trump to say that Korea or South Korea is a money-making machine, it was in the context of an economic discussion, and he meant it as about as high a compliment as this president gives. I think that South Korea and all of our allies are sure to face the president coming into office and really examining the economics of our presence in countries and our alliances. And in that respect, South Korea will be no different than NATO as an organization and our NATO allies. How much that is and what it's based upon, frankly, I'm not sure he knows in advance. I know a lot of figures have been thrown around. There's been some tacit agreements on where that goes. I know that to date, a lot of the concerns of the Department of Defense are strategic assets normally are not included in those equations. So will there be pressure? Almost guaranteed. Will South Korea be alone? Absolutely not. Where that'll end up, I'm not entirely sure.
South Korea's Deputy National Security Advisor said a few months ago that should there be a second Trump administration, that administration may ask South Korea to pay for strategic assets and nuclear umbrella. Now, do you think he was hinting that South Korea could go nuclear if such things happen?
I think President Trump is very aware of the domestic pressure in South Korea to go nuclear and to develop its own nuclear program. I don't think that he or any president that I'm aware of or any candidate for president is looking to push North Korea in that direction. My understanding is that both camps are very interested in us maintaining and even deepening our alliance. How that is done, whether it's through compensation or reimbursement or enhanced cooperation, as you know, there's been tremendous steps actually under the Biden administration to do more coordination and pre-planning for nuclear cooperation. I don't know the answer to that, but what I don't think is that you're going to see any distancing under either candidate as far as our relationship. If anything, I think you'll see an intensification.
Mr. Klingner, what is your take about candidates Vice President Harris and former President Trump on how they view the cost sharing with allies and how that would impact the U.S.-Korea relations in the long run?
Well, we don't know what Harris administration's view on the special measures agreement would be because the agreement was just signed and doesn't need to be renegotiated for another 5 years. But presumably her administration would adopt the traditional bipartisan U.S. view that alliances are in our strategic interest. We cannot do it alone. It is in our interest to have a stable Northeast Asia, and we do that by including through the alliances with Japan and South Korea. It's also in U.S. strategic interest to have our forces stationed overseas. It's sort of like, having a policeman walking the beat in a bad neighborhood to deter crime rather than sitting back at headquarters waiting for a crime to occur. So by having our forces in the region, it's more likely deters. And if necessary, it's a quicker response if a crisis occurs. And it's much cheaper having our forces stationed overseas than in the U.S., and a number of studies have shown that, particularly when our allies offset some of the cost of having our forces overseas. Even though it is in our interest to have them there, our allies are providing some of the cost offset. We can debate what percentage should be included, but I don't think we should be seeking to make a profit off of our forces stationed overseas. The Allied contribution, we can debate what percentage it should be, what percentage increase, what is included in the cost-sharing negotiations, whether certain forces, certain rotational forces should be included. It's all very debatable, but I think the most important thing is to focus on that it's in our interest to have alliances facing common threats and challenges, not only North Korea, but also China throughout the Indo-Pacific region. And it's in our interest to have our forces stationed overseas to deter a crisis before it happens.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week, Ms. Long. Mr. Klingner, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.